The night German commanders knew the war was lost. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood alone in his headquarters at Ziegenberg, 20 miles behind the German lines in the Ardennes. Outside, the largest German offensive in the west since 1940 had been underway for 18 hours. Panzer divisions were driving through American positions. Towns were falling. Prisoners were being taken by the thousands. The early reports had been intoxicating. Breakthrough achieved. Enemy surprised. Forward momentum sustained. Hitler's staff had been euphoric, talking of Antwerp, of splitting the Allied armies, of forcing a negotiated peace that would save the Reich. But Rundstedt wasn't celebrating. He stood before a map table, studying not the gains his forces had made, but the gaps in his lines, the fuel consumption reports, the reconnaissance assessments of American reserves that were already beginning to move. His chief of staff had left hours ago, exhausted by the day's frenetic activity. The old field marshal remained unable to sleep, staring at coloured pins that represented divisions, armies, the fate of Germany itself. A single lamp illuminated the map. In that pool of light, Rundstedt saw what no one else yet understood. This offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, the operation the Führer insisted would turn the tide, had already failed. Not in execution, not yet on the battlefield, but in conception, in the fundamental mathematics of war. Rundstedt had commanded armies for 5 years. He had seen victory in France, stalemate in Russia, retreat across Europe. He understood what his younger officers, intoxicated by early success, did not. He understood what Hitler in his underground bunker refused to see. The gaps between what this offensive needed to succeed and what Germany could actually provide were unbridgeable. The Americans had too many reserves. The Reich had too few resources. The weather would clear and Allied aircraft would dominate the skies. The Red Army was preparing a massive winter offensive in the east that would dwarf anything happening in the Ardennes. In the silence of that midnight hour, Rundstedt spoke to no one, but the words formed in his mind with crystalline clarity. This is the end. Not today, not this week, but the end has begun, and nothing will stop it now. He had commanded this offensive under protest. He had argued against it, suggesting smaller, more realistic operations. Hitler had overruled him, as Hitler overruled everyone now. The Führer lived in a world of fantasy armies and miracle weapons. Rundstedt lived in the world as it was. The door opened. His aide entered with fresh coffee and the latest reports. Rundstedt glanced at them. More gains, more American units bypassed, more optimistic assessments. He set them aside and returned to studying the map. His aide hesitated, sensing the field marshal's mood. "Sir, the early successes exceed expectations." Rundstedt didn't look up. Expectations were always too high. He traced a line on the map with his finger, following the route toward Antwerp. "We'll advance for days, perhaps a week. We'll capture ground, take prisoners, spread alarm. Then the weather will clear, their aircraft will come, their reserves will concentrate, and we'll have spent the last strength we had on an operation that changes nothing." The aide said nothing. There was nothing to say. In that room, at that hour, one of Germany's most experienced commanders had performed the calculation his nation's leadership refused to make. He had looked at the equation of men, machines, fuel, time, and Allied response capability, and he had seen the answer. The war wasn't lost because of what happened that day. It had been lost months ago, perhaps years. But tonight, in this room, a man who had helped conquer Europe now understood with absolute clarity that no miracle was coming. No wonder weapon would arrive in time. No political fracture would split the Allies. The mathematics were immutable. Germany would fight on. Men would die. Cities would burn. But the outcome was now certain, written in logistics reports and fuel consumption data and American industrial capacity. Rundstedt returned to his quarters as dawn approached. He would issue orders, command forces, perform his duty. But he would do so with the cold knowledge that he was presiding over Germany's final act. Not as a defeatist, not as a coward, but as a professional soldier who understood that courage and determination, absent the means to employ them effectively, were simply theatrical gestures in a tragedy already written. Part 2. The professionals calculate December the 18th, 1944. Evening. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army, the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. For 3 days, his divisions had been driving west, punching through American lines, seizing crossroads, spreading chaos. On paper, on maps, the offensive looked successful. His staff officers spoke of reaching the Meuse River within days. Manteuffel knew better. In his forward command post, established in a captured Belgian chateau, he reviewed reports with his chief of operations. The room was cold despite a fire in the hearth. Maps covered every surface. The latest intelligence lay scattered across a table, marked with red grease pencil. "Fuel status?" Manteuffel asked. His operations chief consulted a ledger. "Consumption exceeds projections. Several divisions are already below 50%. We captured American fuel dumps at Stavelot, but less than anticipated." Manteuffel nodded. He had spent his career as a panzer commander. He understood mechanized warfare's brutal arithmetic. Tanks didn't run on enthusiasm. They ran on gasoline, and Germany's synthetic fuel production was being destroyed by Allied bombing. This offensive had been launched with fuel stocks that planners admitted were inadequate, even if everything went perfectly. Nothing ever went perfectly. Weather forecast? Clearing by the 22nd, possibly sooner. That was the other equation Manteuffel had calculated from the beginning. The offensive had been timed to exploit several days of fog and low clouds that would ground Allied aircraft. But winter weather was unpredictable. Once the skies cleared, American and British fighters and bombers would return. His columns would be devastated from the air. He walked to the map and studied the American positions. His intelligence officer had done excellent work tracking enemy movements. What Manteuffel saw alarmed him. The Americans were reacting faster than German planning had anticipated. Reserves were moving. The 101st Airborne was already digging in at Bastogne, a critical crossroads. Patton's Third Army was disengaging from operations in Lorraine and wheeling north, an impossibly complex manoeuvre that Manteuffel had hoped would take a week. Early reports suggested Patton would attack in 3 days. "3 divisions are approaching our southern flank," his intelligence officer reported. "American Third Army, Patton commanding." Manteuffel allowed himself a grim smile. He had fought against Patton before. He respected the Americans' operational instincts. "Of course it's Patton. He's the only one of them who understands momentum." He turned to his operations chief. "Time estimate until he hits our flank?" "December 22nd, possibly earlier." The same day the weather was forecast to clear. Manteuffel did the math. In 4 days, perhaps 5, his offensive would face clear skies and American counterattacks from multiple directions. His fuel would be critically low, his infantry would be exhausted, his supply lines would be stretched thin and vulnerable to air attack. Could they reach Antwerp before that happened? Manteuffel studied the map with a professional's cold assessment. Antwerp was still over 100 miles away. Between his current positions and that objective lay multiple American divisions that were growing stronger by the hour, numerous river crossings that would have to be forced, and logistics challenges that were already becoming critical. "Assessment," he said to his operations chief. "Can we reach Antwerp before American reserves and air power stop us?" The room fell silent. His staff had been trained to provide optimistic reports, but these were experienced officers. They understood their commander wanted truth, not fantasy. His operations chief spoke carefully. "Operationally, no, sir. We don't have the fuel. We don't have the time. We'll be facing concentrated American forces within 3 days, and we'll be fighting under their aircraft within 4. Manteuffel nodded. He had known this before the offensive began. He had argued for more limited objectives. Capture Liège, destroy American forces in the Ardennes, create a defensive position that would buy time. Hitler had rejected that plan. The Führer demanded Antwerp, demanded a victory that would split the Allies and change the war's trajectory. Manteuffel was a soldier. He followed orders. But he was also a realist. "Continue the advance. We'll take as much ground as we can. Destroy as many American units as possible. But," he paused, meeting the eyes of his senior officers, "understand what we're doing here. We're not changing the war. We're buying time. A few months, perhaps. No more." One of his younger staff officers, a true believer in final victory, looked stricken. The older hands simply nodded. They had all done the math. They had all seen the intelligence on American production. They had all noticed that for every German division in France, 10 Soviet divisions were massing in Poland. The offensive would continue. Men would fight and many would die. But in this room, on this evening, the professional soldiers had performed their calculations and knew the truth. They were fighting brilliantly, but brilliance without resources was just artistry in service of the inevitable. Part 3. The Intelligence Officer's Burden. December 20th, 1944. Early morning. Colonel Baron Alexis von Rundstedt had spent the war collecting information and telling truths that no one wanted to hear. As head of Foreign Armies West, the intelligence section responsible for assessing Allied forces, he had built the most accurate picture of enemy capabilities in the German military. That accuracy had made him deeply unpopular. Now, 5 days into the Ardennes offensive, von Rundstedt sat in his office reviewing the latest reports with a growing sense of dread. Not because the offensive was failing militarily, German forces continued to advance, but because his intelligence network was providing information that made the operation's ultimate failure mathematically certain. His deputy entered carrying another stack of reconnaissance reports and prisoner interrogations. "Sir, the latest assessments." Von Rundstedt took them and began reading. Each page confirmed what he already knew, but made it more concrete, more unavoidable. The American Ninth Army has halted its offensive and is taking defensive positions along the northern shoulder of our penetration. The First Army is concentrating reserves. The Third Army under Patton has completely disengaged from Lorraine and is moving north. The 101st Airborne has established a defensive perimeter at Bastogne and shows no sign of withdrawing. British XXX Corps is moving to secure the Meuse bridges. Von Rundstedt set down the reports and pulled out a map. He began marking positions in red and blue grease pencil. American divisions were converging on the Ardennes from 3 directions. British forces were establishing the final defensive line his panzers would need to break through. And behind all of this, vast American supply networks were flowing toward the battle, while German logistics struggled to maintain even current positions. "Casualty assessments?" he asked. "American losses are heavy in the breakthrough sectors, but less than we projected. They're defending better than anticipated. Our own casualties are..." His deputy consulted notes. "Mounting. Several elite divisions have lost 30% of their assault strength." That was the other calculation. Germany had committed its last reserves to this offensive. The SS Panzer divisions, the parachute infantry, the best units the Wehrmacht had left, they were all here, being ground down in daily combat. Every casualty was irreplaceable. The Americans could replace their losses. Germany could not. Von Rundstedt had tried to communicate this before the offensive. He had prepared detailed briefings showing American reserve strength, production capacity, and response capabilities. Hitler had dismissed them. The Führer had decided von Rundstedt was a defeatist, perhaps even a traitor. The intelligence colonel had been excluded from key planning meetings. So now he sat in his office watching the data accumulate, seeing the pattern that only someone trained in intelligence analysis could fully appreciate. The Ardennes offensive wasn't just failing to achieve its objectives, it was consuming the last combat-ready divisions Germany possessed while the Soviets prepared a winter offensive that would involve 3 million men and 6,000 tanks. "Sir," his deputy said hesitantly, "should we prepare a summary assessment for High Command?" Von Rundstedt almost laughed. "High Command doesn't want an assessment. They want confirmation of their fantasies." He stood and walked to the window. Snow was falling. Beyond the glass, Germany was fighting for survival with inadequate means and delusional strategy. But von Rundstedt was an officer. He had a duty. "Prepare the assessment. Full detail, American force concentrations, logistics capabilities, projected timeline for counteroffensive, include Soviet preparations in the east, mark it for immediate delivery to OKW." His deputy looked skeptical. "Sir, you know they won't..." "I know they won't listen. I know they'll call me defeatist. I know it changes nothing." Von Rundstedt turned from the window. But 15 years from now, when historians ask who knew, who warned, who tried to stop the madness, there will be a paper trail showing we told them the truth. He returned to his desk and began drafting the assessment. The words came easily. He had been writing versions of this report for months, watching his warnings ignored as Germany lurched from one disaster to the next. Allied forces are concentrating faster than projected. American Third Army will attack our southern flank within 48 hours. Weather is forecast to clear, allowing enemy air superiority to be re-established. Current fuel stocks are insufficient for sustained operations. German casualties are mounting faster than replacements can arrive. Soviet winter offensive is imminent on the Eastern Front. He paused, then added the conclusion that he knew would be rejected. Continuation of offensive operations beyond December 25th is inadvisable. German forces should consolidate gains, establish defensive positions, and preserve combat strength for defense of the Rhine. The operational window for achieving strategic objectives has closed. Von Rundstedt signed the report and handed it to his deputy. Deliver it, then start preparing casualty projections for when we have to fall back. Fall back, sir. We're a week away from retreating, maybe less. Start the planning now so we're not doing it in crisis. His deputy left. Von Rundstedt returned to his maps and his calculations. This was what intelligence work meant, seeing the future written in data, while those in power insisted reality could be bent to their will. The tragedy wasn't that Germany was losing. Any professional could see that. The tragedy was that they were losing unnecessarily, spending lives and resources on operations doomed from conception, while calling realism defeatism and mistaking fantasy for strategic vision. Von Rundstedt worked through the night, documenting the truth for a leadership that had stopped listening months ago. Part 4. The Eastern Calculation, December 22nd, 1944. Night. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, sat in his office in East Prussia reviewing intelligence reports from the Soviet front. Outside, the Ardennes offensive continued and Hitler's headquarters buzzed with discussions of the West. But Guderian's attention was fixed eastward, where a catastrophe was gathering. The reports before him told a story that filled him with cold dread. Soviet forces were massing along the Vistula River in Poland. 3 Soviet fronts, army groups in Western terminology, containing over 2 million men and thousands of tanks were preparing for a winter offensive. The target, East Prussia and the road to Berlin. Guderian had been a panzer pioneer, one of the architects of Germany's early victories. He understood mechanized warfare's possibilities and limitations better than almost anyone. That expertise now allowed him to see with terrible clarity what was about to happen. He stood and walked to the large map of the Eastern Front that dominated one wall. Soviet positions were marked in red. They formed a massive bulge aimed directly at the heart of Germany. The forces available to stop them were marked in blue, thin, scattered, inadequate. The Ardennes has consumed everything, he said to his operations chief, who stood beside him. 20 divisions, our last strategic reserve, our best panzer units, all committed to an offensive in the West that cannot achieve its objectives, while here, he gestured at the map, here is where Germany will live or die. His operations chief, a capable colonel who had served with Guderian since the invasion of France, nodded grimly. I've prepared the assessment you requested. Soviet force concentrations are unprecedented. First Belarusian Front alone has concentrated. 16 armies. Zhukov is commanding personally. Guderian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was the Soviet Union's most capable commander, the man who had stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow and Stalingrad. If Zhukov was personally commanding this offensive, Stalin expected decisive results. When? Intelligence estimates mid-January, possibly sooner if the weather remains favourable for offensive operations. Less than a month. Guderian did the math. The Ardennes offensive would still be consuming German resources. The panzer divisions in the west would be shattered and unable to disengage quickly. Transport networks were disrupted by Allied bombing. Even if orders were issued today to shift forces east, they wouldn't arrive in time. Guderian had been arguing with Hitler for weeks about this. He had begged for the Ardennes forces to be held in reserve or, better yet, deployed to Poland. The Führer had refused, insisting that victory in the West would somehow solve Germany's strategic problems. But there was no victory in the West. Guderian had studied the reports. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was stalled. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army had been stopped cold. American forces were counter-attacking from multiple directions. The weather had cleared, and Allied aircraft were devastating German columns. The entire operation was collapsing, and when it did, those 20 divisions would be combat ineffective for months. They wouldn't be available to stop Zhukov. Force assessment for defending Poland? Guderian asked, though he already knew the answer. His operations chief consulted notes. 30 divisions approximately, but many are under strength. Some are frankly fourth-rate garrison units. Against Zhukov's forces, they'll be destroyed, Guderian interrupted. Probably in the first week. Then there's nothing between the Soviets and Berlin but 300 miles of flat terrain. The room fell silent. Both men understood what this meant. The war in the West was important, but the war in the East was existential. The Western Allies would occupy Germany. The Soviets would destroy it. Guderian had one more meeting scheduled with Hitler, one more chance to argue for transferring forces east before it was too late. But he had been arguing for months. Hitler didn't listen anymore. The Führer lived in a fantasy world where force of will could overcome material reality. Prepare recommendations for defensive positions along the Oder River, Guderian instructed. That's where we'll make our stand when Poland falls. Might as well plan for it now. His operations chief looked stricken. The Oder was barely 40 miles from Berlin. Planning to defend there meant accepting that everything east would be lost. Poland, Silesia, East Prussia, millions of German civilians, hundreds of years of history. Sir, perhaps the Führer will do what he always does, Guderian said bitterly. He'll refuse to face reality until it forces itself upon him. By then it will be too late. So we plan for what will actually happen, not what we wish would happen. He returned to his desk and began drafting yet another memorandum to Hitler, knowing it would be rejected. But a chief of staff had to try, had to document the warnings, had to be able to say, when the catastrophe arrived, that someone had seen it coming and tried to prevent it. The tragedy was that seeing clearly had become a liability in the German high command. Those who understood the strategic situation were dismissed as defeatists. Those who peddled fantasy were promoted, and so the Reich staggered toward destruction, led by men who refused to acknowledge what every competent staff officer could plainly calculate. Guderian worked late into the night, preparing plans for battles he hoped wouldn't have to be fought and warnings he knew wouldn't be heeded. Outside, the first Soviets' reconnaissance patrols were already probing German positions in Poland, preparing the way for the avalanche to come. Part 5. The Field Marshal's Resignation. December 27th, 1944. Afternoon. Field Marshal Walter Model stood in his command bunker near Münstereifel, staring at a situation map that told the story of a failing offensive. Model was not given to despair. He had pulled off impossible defensive victories in Russia. He had stabilized crumbling fronts. He had earned a reputation as Hitler's fireman, the commander sent to desperate situations to work miracles. But there were limits to what even military genius could accomplish without adequate means. And as December drew to a close, Model was reaching those limits. The Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had been underway for 11 days. In that time, German forces had advanced as much as 60 miles in some sectors. They had surrounded the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. They had created chaos in American command networks. They had achieved tactical successes that would have been celebrated in earlier years of the war. But they had not reached Antwerp. They had not split the Allied armies. They had not forced the political crisis Hitler had promised. Instead, they had fought themselves to exhaustion against an enemy that grew stronger by the hour. Model's operations chief entered with the latest reports. Sir, Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne this morning. The 101st is no longer isolated. Model didn't react. He had known relief would come. Patton had wheeled 90 degrees and attacked in less than a week. A feat Model had to admire, even as it doomed German hopes. Our forces at Bastogne, fighting withdrawal to defensive positions. They've been ordered to hold the Bastogne salient. With what? Model's voice was sharp. They've been in combat for nearly 2 weeks. They're exhausted. They're low on everything. And now we're asking them to defend against fresh American divisions with air support. His operations chief had no answer. Both men knew the truth. The offensive had spent its strength. Now they were locked in a battle of attrition they couldn't win. Model walked to the map table. Red markers showed German positions, a bulge driven into American lines, impressive on the map but hollow in reality. Blue markers showed American forces concentrating around that bulge from 3 directions. British forces held the northern shoulder. American First Army held the south. Patton was driving from the southeast. Fuel status across the front? Critical in multiple sectors. Some divisions are down to a few days' supply. Ammunition? Heavy usage. Resupply is difficult due to American air interdiction. Casualties? His operations chief consulted notes. Approximately 67,000 killed, wounded, or missing, over half our assault strength. Model absorbed the numbers without expression. In 2 weeks, the offensive had consumed the combat power of more than a dozen divisions. And what had been achieved? Some ground, some prisoners, a disruption of Allied operations that was already being overcome. He had opposed this offensive from the beginning. Not openly, one didn't openly oppose Hitler's plans, but in his professional assessment. He had argued for more limited objectives, for focusing on defense of the Rhine, for preserving strength for the inevitable crises to come. But Hitler lived in a world where willpower could overcome material reality, where Germany's situation could be reversed by one bold stroke, where Allied political unity was so fragile it would shatter at the first setback. Model had seen too much warfare to believe in such fantasies. He knew that in modern mechanized combat, logistics mattered more than élan. Industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. And Germany had neither the logistics nor the industrial base to sustain operations against enemies who possessed both in abundance. Recommendations? His operations chief asked. Model was silent for a long moment. He was being asked to work another miracle, to find some tactical brilliance that would salvage an operation doomed by strategic overreach. But even Model's considerable abilities couldn't manufacture fuel from air or replace casualties with wishes. Prepare orders for phased withdrawal to defensive positions along the original start line. We'll designate fallback positions at intervals. Prioritize saving the heavy equipment. We'll need those tanks when the Americans attack again. And they will attack, probably within 2 weeks. His operations chief looked shocked. Sir, are you requesting permission to suspend offensive operations? I'm telling you to prepare contingency plans. We're not acknowledging failure yet, but we will be. Soon. Model's voice was heavy with the weight of reality. This offensive was Germany's last chance to influence the war's outcome in the West. It has failed. Not because of execution. Our soldiers fought magnificently. But because the premise was flawed from the beginning. He turned back to the map, tracing the routes German forces would have to follow in retreat. We don't have the fuel to reach Antwerp. We don't have the ammunition to sustain combat at this intensity. We don't have replacements for our losses. And we certainly don't have the air cover we'd need to operate once the weather clears. Those are mathematical facts, not opinions. Should I inform higher headquarters? Model laughed bitterly. Higher headquarters knows. They just don't want to admit it. But reality doesn't care what we admit. The Americans will attack, we'll be forced back, and we'll spend January trying to hold the Rhine with forces that have been shattered for no strategic gain. He dismissed his operations chief and stood alone before the map. Model was a professional soldier. He would continue to command, to maneuver, to fight skillfully with inadequate means. But he did so now without illusions. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last throw of the dice, and it had come up short. What followed would be a fighting retreat across Germany, a series of defensive battles against overwhelming odds, a slow collapse that brilliant tactics could delay but not prevent. Model had served the Reich for 30 years. He had won victories when victory seemed impossible, but even he couldn't win when the fundamental resources for victory didn't exist. The war in the West was functionally over. Now came the endgame, costly, brutal, and inevitable. Part 6. The Führer's Delusion, December 28th, 1944, midnight. In the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler sat before a map of the Ardennes, moving pins that represented divisions, issuing orders to armies that could not obey them, speaking of victories that existed only in his imagination. The reports from the front were being filtered, softened, reinterpreted to avoid triggering one of the Führer's rages. But even the sanitized versions made clear that the offensive had stalled. German forces were locked in combat across a 100-mile front, unable to advance further but unwilling to retreat. Hitler's hands trembled as he moved the pins. The tremor had been worsening for months, a symptom of the various ailments that were slowly destroying his body even as his Reich collapsed around him. But his eyes were still fierce, still capable of the hypnotic intensity that had once held rooms full of generals spellbound. "The offensive continues," he declared to the officers gathered in the bunker. "Model will break through at Bastogne. The 1st SS Panzer Corps will wheel north and seize the Meuse crossings. We will reach Antwerp within 10 days. The officers exchanged glances. None of them believed this, but none would contradict the Führer, not after what had happened to others who had questioned his strategic vision. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff, had the unpleasant duty of presenting actual reports. "Mein Führer, Patton has relieved Bastogne. American forces are counterattacking from multiple directions. Our divisions report critical shortages of fuel and ammunition." Hitler waved this away. "Patton's counterattack will be contained. American units are poorly coordinated. They lack the will for sustained combat. One more blow, one more push, and their lines will collapse." But Jodl had read the intelligence reports that never made it to Hitler's map table. He knew that American reserves were unlimited, that their factories were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, that their air force controlled the skies, that even if the Ardennes offensive somehow reached Antwerp, which it wouldn't, it would only delay the inevitable by months. "Mein Führer," Jodl ventured carefully, "perhaps we should consider consolidating our positions. The offensive has achieved significant disruption of Allied operations. We might—" "Consolidate?" Hitler's voice rose. "Retreat, you mean? Accept defeat? I didn't stop the Soviets at Moscow by consolidating. I didn't create the Reich by accepting limitations." He leaned forward, fixing Jodl with a stare. "The only reason this offensive hasn't succeeded is because my orders aren't being followed with sufficient determination." This was the madness that had infected German strategy. Every failure was attributed to lack of will, lack of faith, insufficient fanaticism, never to the simple reality that Germany was fighting enemies with 5 times its industrial capacity and 10 times its manpower. The meeting continued for another hour. Hitler issued orders for operations that couldn't be executed with forces that didn't exist to achieve objectives that were impossible. His generals noted the orders and left, already planning how to reinterpret them into something that approached military reality. When the room finally cleared, Hitler remained before his maps. In his mind, the Reich was still strong, still capable of reversing its fortunes through will and determination. The millions of Soviet troops massing in Poland didn't exist in his calculation. The endless American production lines were dismissed as exaggerations. The basic mathematics of attrition warfare were rejected as defeatist thinking. This disconnect between the Führer's perception and operational reality had been growing for years. But now, in the winter of 1944, it had become absolute. Hitler commanded phantom armies, planned with non-existent resources, and refused to acknowledge that his Reich had already lost the means to influence the war's outcome. In command posts from the Ardennes to East Prussia, German officers knew the truth. They read the intelligence reports. They tracked casualty rates and fuel consumption. They calculated how long their units could hold against Allied attacks. And they knew, with professional certainty, that Germany was dying. But in Berlin, in the underground bunker where Hitler lived, a different reality prevailed. One where determination mattered more than logistics, where one more offensive could turn the tide, where Germany's enemies would somehow collapse despite every indicator suggesting the opposite. The distance between these two realities, the real war and Hitler's war, had become a chasm. And the German military was trapped in that chasm, fighting brilliantly with inadequate means while being commanded by a leadership that had lost touch with objective reality. As December ended and 1945 began, that chasm would only grow wider until it swallowed what remained of the German armed forces. Part 7. The Reckoning. January 3rd, 1945. Dawn. In command posts across Western Europe, German officers compiled their reports from the Ardennes offensive. The numbers told a story that even Hitler's most loyal adherents couldn't ignore. The offensive had lasted 18 days of major combat. In that time, German forces had advanced between 20 and 60 miles, depending on sector. They had surrounded, but failed to capture Bastogne. They had disrupted Allied operations and caused alarm in American and British command networks. They had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could still mount major offensive operations and fight with skill and determination. But they had not reached the Meuse River, much less Antwerp. They had not split the Allied armies or created the political crisis Hitler had promised. Instead, they had consumed Germany's last strategic reserve, approximately 100,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks and aircraft, and fuel stocks that could never be replaced, in return for a temporary bulge in the Allied lines that was already being compressed from 3 directions. General der Panzertruppen, Heinrich Eberbach, who had watched the offensive from a headquarters in Germany, summarized what every professional officer knew. "We have fought brilliantly and achieved nothing decisive. We are now weaker than before the offensive began, while the Americans are stronger. This is called losing." The assessment was shared across the German officer corps, spoken in hushed conversations in command bunkers and staff headquarters. The Ardennes offensive hadn't just failed to achieve its objectives. It had accelerated Germany's collapse by consuming irreplaceable resources on an operation that never had realistic chances of success. On the Eastern Front, the consequences were even more severe. Guderian's warnings had proven prophetic. On January 12th, the Soviets launched a massive winter offensive involving over 2 million men and 6,000 tanks. The German defenders, stripped of reserves by the Ardennes operation, were overwhelmed within days. By month's end, the Red Army would be within 100 miles of Berlin. In the west, American and British forces began compressing the Ardennes Bulge immediately. German units fell back, fighting skillfully, but with dwindling resources against an enemy that grew stronger daily. By late January, German forces would be driven back to their original start lines, having gained nothing permanent from their offensive. The strategic situation was irretrievable. Germany now faced massive offensives from both east and west, with a military that had been bled white in the Ardennes. The professional soldiers who had calculated the offensive's futility in December now prepared for the final battles they had known were coming. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had commanded the Ardennes offensive with deep misgivings, would later tell Allied interrogators, "I knew the operation would fail before it began. The question was never whether we would reach Antwerp. The question was how much it would cost us to discover that we couldn't. The answer was everything we had left." General von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had come closest to breaking through, was more blunt. "We lost the war on December 16th, 1944. Not because the Ardennes offensive failed, it was already lost before that, but because we spent our last reserves on a fantasy when we should have been preparing to defend Germany's core territory." In February, Allied forces would cross the Rhine. In April, American and Soviet troops would meet at the Elbe. In May, Germany would surrender unconditionally. The path from the Ardennes to final defeat was straight and unavoidable, exactly as German military. The tragedy was that so many would die in the months that followed. Soldiers on both sides, civilians caught in the fighting, concentration camp victims murdered in the final spasm of Nazi barbarity, all for an outcome that had become inevitable. The German commanders who knew the war was lost in December 1944 continued to fight because orders required it, because duty demanded it, because they were professionals who served their country even when they could no longer serve its cause. They fought skillfully and often courageously, but they fought without illusions. History would record the Ardennes offensive as Germany's last major attack in the West, a final, desperate gamble that briefly alarmed the Allies before being crushed by overwhelming force. But for the German officers who lived through it, who calculated its futility and commanded its doomed operations, it was something else. The moment when military professionalism confronted political fantasy and recognized that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome strategic insanity. In those cold December nights in command posts from Belgium to East Prussia, German commanders performed calculations and reached conclusions that their leadership refused to accept. They saw the war's end written in logistics reports and casualty figures and enemy force concentrations. They understood that Germany would fight on, but that fighting on had become a matter of honour and duty rather than any realistic hope of victory. The night German commanders knew the war was lost wasn't a single night. It was many nights in many places as professional soldiers confronted data that led to only one conclusion. Some reached that understanding earlier than others. Some expressed it openly, others kept it to themselves. But by the end of December 1944, the knowledge had spread through the German officer corps like a cold wind. The war is lost. The only questions remaining are how long it lasts and how many more will die before the inevitable end.